Today I will be talking about focus, which is something I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I want to bring it up for my own sake as well. It's interesting to record a video like this on a subject that I'm thinking a lot actively about. And let's talk about what focus is. So, in our minds, we have a very limited amount of mental capacity to focus on any subjects. So, as things come into our brain, we have this meter or canister that gets filled up. And the more and more things come, eventually it's gonna flow over, and we can only focus on a finite amount of the things that we have in front of us. There's all sort of filtering processes taking place within our brains to see that this happens. And another interesting thing is that focus is also very dependent on how much you think about something. So you can have an idea that takes up very little focus, but if you nurture it in just the right ways, it's going to grow and take up a lot of focus. So a good example of this is that on certain substances, people can like stare at a leaf for hours, that filling their entire focus. And those are like very interesting concepts. And all of this is really a cornerstone of things that made the first Amnesia and sequential Amnesias and other horror games work, which is that you narrow down what the player focuses on in order to enhance those elements. So what you're sort of looking for is that you have an idea, you have something you want to be doing, you want something for the player to experience. This can be a horror experience, but it could be an idea, whatever, and you need to make sure that that idea grows, that is what the full focus of the player is like, and that can have drastic effects on what sort of experience the player is going to have. And the three main things that are going to determine just how this focus works is context, incentives, and attention, which without me actually wanting to, this is CIA, but that's a pretty good memento, I guess. But it's pretty funny when I noticed it as I wrote this down. And you can think about this as prisms, I guess, and so that you have a brain here. It has a certain amount of attention coming or attention available, and you can use all of these prisms to focus in various ways. So if you have bad context, the focus is gonna go in ways where you don't want it to, but if you're good, it's gonna narrow it down, and your sort of idea, your end goal is for all of the attention to go onto this, whatever is the focus of your game or idea. Talk a little bit more about how we think about these various things. So first, about focus. Say that you are walking home, you're walking home basically, and you're doing this in the middle of the day, sun is shining, there are friendly people at the distance, or friendly looking people at the distance. This is fine. You are not going to pay any extra attention at this point. Like, there's no increase in focus. Think instead you're doing this in the dark, in what you heard is a bad neighborhood, and that there's shady figures lurking around. This looks like some sort of murderous aliens, I guess. But in any case, you'll notice a substantial difference in your thinking and your focus because of this context. Now all of a sudden you're like aware of every sound being made. What was that? Was that footsteps? Whereas in this, it's like you don't really care about it as much. So very important how you set up context. The other thing is incentives. So incentives is very, very important. Like, how do we reward the player for paying attention? And what do we actually reward them in paying attention to? So say that you have an art exhibition and you want, say, kids or the whoever is visiting this art exhibition to pay more attention to the art, to have more focus. So you come up with this brilliant idea if you're gonna just place smiley stickers and like, oh, count the smiley stickers. Whoever counts the most or counts them all wins the prize. And this is really bad incentive. They're not gonna care about the art anymore. They're gonna care about the smiley stickers. So you're diverting focus from what your main goal is. And you might think, is anyone really gonna do this in an actual game? Yes, they are. So a good example of this is my favorite game to pick on. I really love the Dead Space series overall, but this Dead Space on the Wii, Dead Space Extraction, well, it has some flaws. It has some cool stuff too, I guess. I mean, rail shooters are pretty fun, but what it does is that it means that when you're in cutscenes or anytime in the game, you have to look for pickups. So they're gonna be hidden all around the screen. So you're in like an exciting moments, like, holy shit, he lost it, help! And this player's supposed to be into this, but you're like, oh, where are the where are the pickups I need? Where are the pickups I need? So that's going to be your main focus during that. And this is very explicit, but it's very, very common in games. Like it's finding items and so on in various environments that's gonna detract from what your focus is, and you want that this sort of interaction, this sort of the player mentally scanning the environments are going to be something that enhances their focus, not detracts from it. And a good example is how this works in horror games. And when it works is that you have like a corridor, and the player is incentivized to think what lies behind the next corner. Like what can it be that lurks there? Is there some danger? So they're always on the watch for it. And if they're not on the watch for it, something goes out and goes booga booga boo. And then they're like, no, I missed it. I gotta pay more attention. Now they have an incentive to put focus on where you want them to put focus, instead of putting focus on finding smiley faces or the equivalent of smiley faces. Good example of this is FNAF, Five Nights at Freddy's, where you have to get, like, constantly be on the watch for at this door. I mean, the mechanic itself is sort of stupid, but it works really, really well. I think Friday Night at Freddy's is an excellent designed game. I should probably make a whole video about just analyzing that at some point. But there you're incentivized to like if you're not paying attention to sounds, movements on the cameras and so on, you're gonna get a booga booga boo scare. So player has totally attention where you want them to have the attention. So that's a very important one. The other one is again, I said attention or so on, but that's another point. And attention is really opposite of distraction. And very like typical example of this is modern HUDs, where you have like all sort of things to think about, which is going to distract you from other things, even though you might feel like, well, these are important, like there's a mini-map here. The player needs to know how to find their way around. There's a health meter. The player needs to know how much health they have. Oh, a friend just joined in. The player needs to know that. And you always have these good intentions for adding these things, but in reality, they're going to detract over time. And you have to be very, very careful about this. And now the HUD is a very specific example, but think about it as a broader how you build a play space sort of sense. And what you're really aiming for is this sort of like, again, the horror is a good example of this, where you have like one object that becomes the main focus, where any sort of art does that a lot. If there's like all stuff all over the place, you're going to miss out on it. But if there's like one object in the scene that draws your attention, that's going to be what you're focusing on. And you want your idea to be just like that. And the general thing is that like less is more, which is like a very cliche thing to say, but it's so true, and it's so easy to forget. Like when I wrote this down and when I'm saying this, is like, oh, this is obvious, but it's not obvious. I constantly forget it. I see games forgetting it all the time. And what happens is that you have this idea where it's like this is really cool. this is what the game is about. Like, I have this thing I want people to connect to people to experience, and so on. But then you're like, yeah, the control scheme. You have to think about I also want to have some cool control scheme. And oh yeah, there's also some other like you have to read up on some stuff. There's some lore, I don't know, that the player needs to take into account. And we have some cool mechanics, and all of these sort of divert. The player is now looking away from what the core idea should be. What you instead want, that you want all of these ideas to focus. They shouldn't distract. They should attract attention to this core idea, which is what you want your players to be focusing on. And this is really it. So when you're doing games, you want to be thinking CIA. What would CIA do in this circumstance? Like context, incentives, and attention. And when you're thinking about the focus for your game. And I also want to bring up, so problems arise. Problems arise much less if you're a very systems-driven game. So if you're a systems-driven game, in your first prototype, the first hour of coding your game, you have like a white box levels. There's you have a box as a weapon, and there's, I don't know, balls coming at you that should be monsters or whatever later on. Attention is full. Attention is directed to what you want. You from the get-go, you know what your attention is, and you sort of build on that. And you can go wrong here. Like the modern HUD is an excellent example of how you go wrong in these sort of simple beginnings as well, but you pose much less of a problem. Problems arise when your goal is narrative in nature. And thing is, the first white box level has no dialogue. It has no art, it has no ambience, none of the things that is going to build context, incentives, and attention at this point. It's just blank. And you're like, well, at this point, the player has really nothing to pay focus on. Like when your game meter attention is like this, where it's like it's just dried up, there's nothing to pay attention to, player's going to be attention to something else. They're going to look at their phone or something like that. It's just like, because they're deprived of stimuli at this point. And this is where the critical thing is. I talked earlier about the design attractors. So you're going to be super duper you're as a designer going to be incentivized and very lured at, why don't we add something else, some cool mechanics. So say, let's add a combat system of monsters. And what's happening then is that we talked the design attractor thing is, so you're going here in your design, like this is the narrative goal that you're going for, and you're like heading in that direction. That's what you want to go. And then you say, why not combat? And then this gigantic black hole of an attractor appears, and you're going to be sucked into that. You're going to have a really hard time staying away and keeping on track for that goal. And the thing is that, I mean, when you start filling this space up, you are going to achieve your CIA. Your goals start appearing. But they're not going to do that at an early stage. You have much more of an uphill struggle, and you need to think about these things. That's why it's so important sometimes to, like, why all of this theory? Why should I, like, I gotta go on gut feeling. But your gut feeling is going to make you do the wrong things at some point, because you can't really rely on it for certain stuff when it comes to attention. Like, you can't see these things at this point, and you have to be thinking about it differently. Okay, I think this is very interesting. There's more to say about this, but hopefully this is a good introduction and gives some pointers on what